It all started as an elaborate scheme. Matthew Kavanagh, a self-made millionaire in his mid-30s, had a flair for theatrics. He loved extravagant gestures, the kind that made people gossip for weeks. His latest idea? A lottery to win an all-expenses-paid trip to the Maldives with him as the travel companion. The twist? The winner had already been chosen, or so he thought. Matthew was smitten with Mia, a vibrant, artsy woman he had met at a gallery opening. She was everything he admired, sharp, witty, and a little out of his league. But Mia was guarded, dismissing most of Matthew's advances with polite but firm indifference. Determined to win her over, he concocted the lottery idea. He figured if they spent a week together in paradise, she might see him in a new light. "I'll let her win, but it'll look totally random," he told his assistant Julia, who was tasked with organizing the details. Julia, sharp and efficient but chronically overworked, nodded while typing furiously on her laptop. "Got it. I'll arrange the entries, make sure she wins, and handle the logistics." Everything was set. A month-long social media campaign drew thousands of entries, though Matthew only cared about one. On the day of the drawing, Matthew sat in his penthouse with a glass of wine, eagerly waiting for Julia to send over the results. When her message popped up, he grinned and opened it. His grin froze halfway. The winner wasn't Mia. It was Emily Caldwell, a cheerful schoolteacher with an infectious laugh and a penchant for wearing floral dresses. She had entered on a whim after seeing the lottery on Instagram, never expecting to win. Matthew's jaw tightened. "Julia, what the hell?" he barked into his phone. "Relax," Julia said, her tone exhausted. "There was a mix-up in the algorithm I used. I triple-checked, and Emily was the legitimate winner. You can't exactly revoke her prize." Matthew groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll make the best of it. But this is not how it was supposed to go." Days later, Matthew met Emily at the airport. She was practically bouncing with excitement, while Matthew looked every bit the disgruntled billionaire trying to salvage a botched plan. "Thanks for this incredible opportunity," Emily gushed as they boarded his private jet. "I still can't believe I won." Matthew forced a smile, his thoughts elsewhere. As the plane soared over the clouds, he pulled out his phone and texted Mia. "Matthew, hey, just wanted to say I wish you were here. Maybe when I get back, we can grab dinner?" A reply pinged almost immediately. "Mia, enjoy your trip, Matthew. Send me a pic of the view, winky face." She included a winking emoji, and Matthew's mood lifted slightly. Maybe this trip wouldn't be a total loss if Mia stayed interested. But Matthew didn't notice Emily glance sideways at his phone, her smile dimming just a little as she turned back to the window. Matthew spent most of the flight trying to stay polite while fielding Emily's bubbly chatter. She was nice, too nice. It was disarming, really. He wasn't used to people who talked to him without a hint of agenda. Emily told him about her students, her dreams of traveling the world, and even shared a silly story about accidentally grading a test upside down. Matthew laughed despite himself but quickly checked his phone. Mia had sent him a picture, a candid shot of her lounging on her couch with a glass of wine. "Thinking of you," she'd added. He was smiling at the screen when Emily glanced over and caught the text. Her expression faltered for a second, but she masked it quickly with a cheerful question. "So, what's the first thing you're excited to do in the Maldives?" Matthew, distracted, muttered something generic. "Probably the beach." Emily smiled politely but shifted her attention to the in-flight magazine. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Upon arriving at their resort, Emily was in awe. The private villa was stunning, perched over crystalline water, with a plunge pool and a panoramic view of the horizon. "This is the kind of place I've only ever seen on postcards," she marveled, spinning in the middle of the living room. "Thank you, Matthew. I still can't believe I'm here." Matthew grunted in acknowledgement, already pulling out his phone to snap pictures of the view. Within minutes, he was texting Mia again. "Matthew, you'd love it here. Sunset's unbelievable. Thinking of you. Mia's reply came with a photo that made his pulse quicken, a close-up of her in lacy lingerie, coyly biting her lip. Emily, sitting on the deck with a coconut cocktail, caught Matthew's lingering gaze on his phone. She didn't need to see the screen to know his thoughts weren't with her. She took a deep sip, deciding to focus on the perks of the trip instead of her companion's emotional absence. The next few days unfolded awkwardly. Emily tried her best to enjoy the Maldives, while Matthew remained glued to his phone. Whenever Emily suggested an activity, snorkeling, paddleboarding, or simply walking along the beach, Matthew either declined or half-heartedly joined, only to sneak glances at his messages. By the fourth day, Emily had had enough. That morning, she found him at breakfast, scrolling through his phone again. "Matthew," she said gently, but with a firmness he wasn't used to. "If there's someone else you'd rather be here with, why didn't you invite her instead?" Matthew froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What makes you say that?" Emily gave him a look that said she wasn't buying his act. "I'm not blind. I see how distracted you are. I don't mind, I didn't expect this," she gestured between them, "to be a romance novel. But you don't have to pretend you're enjoying this trip with me when your mind is somewhere else." Her words stung. Not because they were harsh, but because they were true. For a moment, Matthew considered defending himself, but Emily's unassuming honesty disarmed him. "I didn't mean to ignore you," he admitted. "This trip didn't exactly go as planned." Emily chuckled dryly. "No kidding." There was an awkward silence, broken only by the waves lapping against the villa. Finally, Matthew spoke. "I'll make it up to you. What do you want to do today?" Emily studied him carefully, as if deciding whether to believe him. "A beach picnic," she said. "No phones. Just the ocean, some food, and conversation." Matthew hesitated, then nodded. "Deal." To his surprise, the picnic turned out to be nice. For the first time in days, Matthew wasn't distracted. Emily's stories about her students, her favorite books, and her dreams of becoming a writer captivated him more than he expected. She wasn't Mia, not by a long shot, but there was something refreshing about her. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Matthew caught himself genuinely smiling. Emily noticed and gave him a curious look. "See? This isn't so bad," she teased. "You might even be having fun." He chuckled. "Maybe I am." That night, as Emily retired to her room, Matthew sat on the deck, staring at the stars. He reached for his phone but hesitated. Mia had sent him another photo, this one more provocative than the last. But instead of texting back, he found himself looking toward Emily's room. What was he doing? For the first time, he wasn't sure. Matthew spent most of the day lounging by the infinity pool, his phone never far from his grasp. Every time it buzzed with a new notification, his pulse quickened. He had grown addicted to Mia's messages, the way her words teased and provoked. It was a game they both played well. This time, though, she upped the stakes. The photo that popped onto his screen was breathtaking, Mia stretched across her couch, wrapped in silk lingerie that barely left anything to the imagination. "Mia, wish you were here to take this off." Matthew swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. His skin prickled under the heat of the tropical sun, though he doubted the temperature was to blame. "Damn," he muttered under his breath, leaning back into the plush sunbed. He stared at the picture longer than he should have, his thoughts wandering to all the ways he'd act on the invitation, if only Mia were here. But she wasn't. Matthew glanced sideways. Emily lay on the adjacent lounger, completely oblivious to his distraction. She wore a simple black swimsuit, her skin glowing under the afternoon sun. She wasn't Mia, but there was something effortlessly sensual about her in this light, the curve of her legs, the way her damp hair clung to her shoulders. Matthew shook his head. Focus. Another buzz. Another message. "Mia, don't make me wait too long, Matthew. You know I hate waiting." The heat pooling in his chest and stomach had become unbearable. He couldn't just sit here, simmering in frustration. His gaze flicked to Emily again, lingering this time. The image of Mia faded from his mind, replaced by the woman right in front of him. Emily glanced his way, catching his eyes, before he could look away. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft and curious. "Yeah," he said quickly, too quickly. "Fine." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't push. She turned back to her book, unaware of the storm brewing beside her. That night, the resort hosted a casual beach party. Emily had been thrilled by the idea, but Matthew found himself distracted throughout. The drinks, the music, the laughter, it all blurred as his thoughts remained split. Mia's messages had kept coming, each one more enticing than the last. But they only left him restless, attention coiling tighter every time he imagined her. Yet, every time he looked at Emily, he couldn't shake the unsettling thought, she's here. She's real. By the time the party wound down, Matthew's patience had worn thin. He wasn't sure if it was the cocktails or the unresolved tension, but when Emily suggested a moonlit walk along the shore, he didn't hesitate. They strolled in silence for a while, the waves lapping at their feet. Emily tilted her head up to the sky, her face serene in the pale light. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" she said softly, almost to herself. Matthew didn't reply. He was barely looking at the ocean. His focus was entirely on her, how the moonlight highlighted the curve of her jaw, the slope of her neck. Without thinking, he reached out and touched her arm. Emily turned, startled. "Matthew?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. His hand lingered on her arm, sliding down to her wrist. Emily's breath hitched, her eyes searching his face. "Are you okay?" she asked again, her voice unsteady this time. He wasn't okay. His mind was a chaotic mess of desire, guilt, and something else he couldn't name. But in that moment, the pull was undeniable. "Emily," he said, his voice low and strained. "Do you trust me?" She blinked, caught off guard by the intensity in his tone. I think so." That was all he needed. Before she could say another word, he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was more desperate than tender. Emily froze for a moment, then melted against him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. Matthew's hands found her waist, pulling her closer. His thoughts of Mia, her photos, her teasing messages, they all burned away in the heat of the moment. All that mattered now was Emily, her warmth, her touch, the way she responded to him with equal fervor. The ocean roared in the background, but neither of them noticed. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Emily stared at him, her lips parted in confusion. "Matthew," she began, but he silenced her with another kiss, softer this time. "Let's go back," he whispered against her lips, his voice thick with longing. Emily hesitated, her heart racing. But when his hand found hers, she didn't pull away. The villa was quiet, save for the distant hum of the ocean and the occasional chirp of night insects. Matthew and Emily returned from the beach party in near silence, though the air between them felt heavier than it had earlier. Emily was lost in thought, replaying the evening in her mind, Matthew's lingering glances, the way his hand had brushed hers as they walked along the shore. It wasn't like him to be so attentive, and it left her feeling unsettled. Matthew, meanwhile, was battling his own turmoil. The texts from Mia had been relentless throughout the day, escalating in tone and imagery. Her last message before the party still played in his mind, igniting a fire he couldn't seem to extinguish. And yet, here he was, walking beside Emily, drawn to her in a way he hadn't anticipated. Inside the villa, Emily lingered by the door, unsure of what to say. Matthew had barely spoken since they left the beach, his face unreadable. She started to turn toward her room when his voice stopped her. "Emily." She looked back, startled by the urgency in his tone. He stepped closer, his expression difficult to decipher. "I don't know how to say this, but, thank you." "For what?" she asked, her voice soft. For being here, he said, his gaze holding hers. For putting up with me this week. Emily's lips quirked into a faint smile. You don't have to thank me for that. This trip has been unexpected, but not bad. Matthew nodded, though his expression didn't soften. His mind was a mess, caught between thoughts of Mia's flirtatious texts and the undeniable pull he felt toward Emily in the moment. She was nothing like Mia, she didn't provoke or tease him. But her calm presence, her unassuming warmth, had gotten under his skin. He hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. Emily, But before he could finish, his phone buzzed again. The sound shattered the fragile atmosphere, and Emily's smile faltered. You should check that, she said, her tone neutral. Matthew glanced at his phone, the screen glowing with another notification from Mia. His jaw tightened. It can wait. Emily's brows knit together, but she said nothing. Instead, she offered him a small nod and excused herself, retreating to her room. Alone on the balcony, Matthew leaned against the railing, staring out at the moonlit ocean. The cool night air did little to quell the heat of his thoughts. He unlocked his phone, skimming Mia's latest messages. They were more direct than ever, filled with promises and provocations that made his chest tighten. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. This trip had been a mistake from the start, a plan that had gone sideways in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't supposed to be here with Emily, wasn't supposed to feel this strange sense of guilt for being distracted by someone else. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to reply to Mia. Not now. Not after the way Emily had looked at him tonight. For the first time in years, Matthew felt truly conflicted, not about what he wanted, but about why he wanted it. Inside, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She had seen the way Matthew's demeanor shifted whenever his phone buzzed, the way he seemed to retreat into himself. Part of her wanted to confront him, to ask who, or what, was pulling his attention away. But another part of her already knew. I need to stop overthinking this, she whispered to herself. This isn't about me. Still, the knot in her chest refused to loosen. The night passed slowly, each of them lost in their separate thoughts. By morning, the lines between them had blurred even further, setting the stage for the days to come. Matthew's restlessness grew sharper as the day wore on. Mia's messages hadn't stopped, each one a calculated spark to the fire she knew how to ignite in him. The latest photo, a candid shot that left little to the imagination, was the final straw. He stared at the screen for what felt like ages, tension coiling in his chest. His pulse raced, and for a fleeting moment, he considered replying, sending something back, to fan the flames further. But the distance between them, the undeniable fact that Mia wasn't here, left him agitated and unsatisfied. He tossed his phone onto the nightstand with more force than necessary, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if that would dull the heat that had risen within him. His thoughts, unbidden, shifted to Emily. She was in the villa's common area, reading quietly on the couch. She'd been a steady presence all week, easygoing, kind, and entirely oblivious to the turmoil Matthew was hiding. He glanced toward her now, noticing the soft glow of the evening light catching her features. She wasn't Mia. She didn't send coy texts or calculated photos. But she was here. And in that moment, that mattered more than he expected. The evening unfolded in a haze. Emily suggested they watch a movie, something lighthearted to pass the time. Matthew agreed, though he barely focused on the screen. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the flickering shadows on the walls and the unfamiliar pull he felt toward the woman sitting just a few feet away. When the movie ended, Emily stretched and smiled at him. Thanks for humoring me, she said lightly. I know you're more of a business documentary kind of guy. Matthew chuckled faintly, his gaze lingering on her longer than it should have. It wasn't so bad. Something in his tone made Emily pause, her brow furrowing slightly. Are you okay? She asked. You've been different today. Matthew hesitated, unsure how to respond. I'm fine, he said finally. Just thinking. Emily didn't press further, though she watched him closely as she stood. Well, I'm heading to bed. Good night, Matthew. Good night, he murmured, his voice quieter than usual. She turned and walked toward her room, but Matthew remained seated, the air around him thick with unresolved tension. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. But the thoughts swirling in his mind wouldn't let him rest. Later that night, the villa was silent, save for the faint sound of the ocean in the distance. Matthew's room was dim, the glow of his phone screen casting faint shadows. Another message from Mia had come in, but he hadn't opened it. Instead, his thoughts lingered on Emily. Her presence was both a distraction and a strange comfort, one he hadn't anticipated but couldn't ignore. The fire Mia had lit in him earlier hadn't gone out, but it had shifted, its focus redirected in ways he couldn't quite explain. By the time morning came, the villa felt different. The quiet tension that had hung between them all week seemed to have shifted, leaving something unspoken in its wake. The sunlight spilled through the villa's windows, casting long, golden streaks across the floor. Emily woke early, as she often did, and padded quietly to the kitchen for coffee. Her mind felt hazy, as if she were still sorting through fragments of the previous night. Something had shifted, she felt it in the way Matthew had looked at her, the weight of his silence. When Matthew joined her a short while later, his demeanor was subdued. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, his gaze distant. "Sleep well?" Emily asked lightly, trying to cut through the quiet. He nodded, though his response was delayed. "Yeah. You?" "Fine," she said, though the word felt inadequate. She sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of her mug. He seemed different. Not distracted, as he had been before, but introspective. They ate breakfast in near silence, broken only by the occasional clink of silverware. Emily didn't mind, she was still untangling her own thoughts. It wasn't until they stepped out onto the deck later that Matthew spoke again. "Emily." She turned to him, surprised by the weight in his tone. "Yeah? I just want to say thanks," he said, his words careful. "For being here. For putting up with me this week." Emily smiled faintly, though her expression held a touch of curiosity. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad this trip hasn't been a total disaster." Matthew smirked at that, a flicker of amusement breaking through his seriousness. "You've made it better than it could have been." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She didn't reply right away, unsure of what to say. Instead, she simply nodded, letting the moment pass without overanalyzing it. But even as the day wore on and they slipped back into their usual rhythm, the shift between them remained palpable, an unspoken understanding that neither was quite ready to put into words. The night was quiet, the villa bathed in silver light from the moon. Matthew had spent hours restless, pacing the balcony with his phone in hand. Another notification buzzed, and he finally gave in, swiping to open Mia's latest message. The photo hit him like a spark, reigniting the tension that had simmered all day. Mia knew exactly how to play the game, posing in a way that was both provocative and calculated. Her caption was playful, teasing. "Mia, wish you were here to keep me company. I'm all alone tonight." Matthew's jaw tightened as he stared at the screen. He felt the familiar pull, the way her photos always managed to captivate him. But tonight, something was different. The excitement felt hollow, the distance between them insurmountable. His thoughts wandered, unbidden, to Emily. She was here, in the next room. She wasn't sending coy messages or trying to capture his attention through a screen. She was real, tangible, and her quiet presence over the past week had drawn him in without him realizing it. Matthew set his phone down, the photo suddenly losing its allure. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped toward Emily's door and knocked softly. When she opened it, her expression shifted from surprise to curiosity. "Matthew? Is everything okay?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her face, illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. There was no artifice in her beauty, no carefully staged angles or filters. She was simply herself, and in that moment, it was more captivating than anything Mia had ever sent him. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. Emily stepped aside, her brow furrowing slightly as she watched him. "What's going on?" Matthew hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've been distracted this whole trip," he admitted finally. "But not by the things I thought I would be." Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak, giving him space to continue. "I didn't expect this," he said, gesturing vaguely between them. "But being here with you has made me realize how much I've been chasing things that don't matter." Emily's expression was unreadable, her silence stretching between them. But when she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "What do you want, Matthew?" He didn't have an answer, not a clear one, at least. All he knew was that the pull toward her was undeniable, and whatever had been stirring inside him all week had reached a point where it couldn't be ignored. The rest of the night unfolded quietly, without words or fanfare. What passed between them was unspoken, but undeniable, a culmination of all the tension and unacknowledged feelings that had simmered just below the surface. By the time dawn broke, Matthew lay awake, watching the soft light filter through the curtains. Emily was asleep beside him, her breathing steady and peaceful. He couldn't stop staring at her, marveling at how different she seemed now, how different he felt. When his phone buzzed on the nightstand, he glanced at it briefly. Another message from Mia. He didn't even open it. For the first time in years, her photos didn't stir anything in him. The thrill he had once felt seemed distant, overshadowed by the warmth and clarity he now felt for Emily. She shifted slightly in her sleep, and Matthew smiled faintly, a sense of calm settling over him. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he wanted to be. Matthew woke early, the room washed in soft, golden light. For a moment, he lay still, his gaze fixed on the peaceful rise and fall of Emily's breathing. The events of the night before replayed in his mind, vivid yet surreal. Everything had changed, though he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment the shift began. Emily stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked, meeting his gaze with a soft smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm but tentative. "Good morning," he replied. His tone carried an ease he hadn't felt in weeks. Emily propped herself up slightly, brushing her hair from her face. She studied him quietly for a moment before asking, "Are you okay?" Matthew's expression softened. "Better than okay," he said. "What about you?" Her smile widened just a little. "Better than okay." The weight of their unspoken understanding hung between them, but it was comforting rather than stifling. The morning passed with an unspoken sense of renewal. After breakfast, they strolled along the beach, their conversation light but unhurried. At one point, Emily gestured toward the horizon where a cluster of sailboats dotted the water. "I used to dream about this kind of view," she admitted. "When I was a kid, I'd see photos of places like this in magazines and think, maybe one day." Matthew smiled at her, his steps slowing. "And now you're here." "Now I'm here," she echoed, glancing at him. "Funny how life works sometimes." He chuckled softly. Funny doesn't even begin to cover it. For once, he wasn't distracted. His mind wasn't half occupied by messages from someone else, nor was he analyzing what came next. He was just present, something he hadn't been in a long time. Over lunch, Matthew's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with yet another notification from Mia. Emily noticed the shift in his expression as he glanced at it, though he didn't move to pick it up. "You're not going to check it?" she asked, her tone light but curious. Matthew hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "No. I don't think it's important." Emily's brow lifted slightly in surprise. "Progress," she said with a small, approving smile. Matthew let out a short laugh, though there was truth in her observation. For the first time, Mia's messages didn't pull at him the way they once had. By the time the sun began to set, the two of them were back at the villa, seated on the deck as the sky blazed with color. Emily leaned against the railing, her expression serene as she watched the horizon. Matthew turned to her, his voice breaking the quiet. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him, her brows knitting slightly in confusion. "For what?" "For how I've been this week," he explained. His voice was steady, though laced with sincerity. "When this trip started, my mind was somewhere else. Someone else. And I let that keep me from seeing what was right in front of me." Emily's gaze softened, though she remained quiet, letting him continue. "I didn't expect to find this," Matthew said, gesturing vaguely between them. "But being here with you has made me realize how much I've been chasing the wrong things. Things that don't matter." Emily's lips curved into a faint smile. "You don't have to explain," she said gently. "No, I do," he insisted. "Because I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. You've been patient with me, and you didn't have to be. I just want you to know how much I appreciate that." She turned fully toward him, studying his face for a long moment. Then she smiled again, this time warmer. "You're being a little hard on yourself," she said. "Maybe," Matthew admitted, his voice quieter. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm starting to get things right." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Matthew's gaze drifted toward Emily, and for the first time, he felt completely at ease, not with the situation, but with himself. Whatever had come before, and whatever lay ahead, one thing was clear: Emily wasn't a distraction. She was the reason he wanted to stay present. And for now, that was enough. The following day began like the others, with sunlight pouring into the villa and the faint scent of ocean air drifting through the open windows. Matthew and Emily shared a quiet breakfast, the conversation easy and unhurried. For the first time in weeks, Matthew wasn't checking his phone or fielding texts from Mia. Emily noticed the change, but didn't comment on it. Instead, she watched him with quiet amusement as he poured himself a second cup of coffee. "You're surprisingly relaxed today," she remarked. Matthew chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I think I finally figured out how to slow down. Took a while." "Well, better late than never," Emily teased, her smile warm. The moment was interrupted by the sharp buzz of Matthew's phone, which sat face down on the table. He glanced at it briefly, before sighing. "Work?" Emily asked, though she could tell by his expression it wasn't. Matthew flipped the phone over, revealing Mia's name on the screen. He hesitated before answering. "Matthew speaking," he said, his tone guarded. On the other end, Mia's voice was as smooth and confident as always. "You've been quiet lately. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." Matthew's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "I've been busy," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Mia's laugh was light, playful. "Too busy to even reply to a few texts? That doesn't sound like you." Matthew glanced at Emily, who was pretending not to listen but failing miserably. He stood and walked to the far side of the room, lowering his voice. "Look, Mia, now's not a great time." "You sound different," Mia said, her tone shifting slightly. "Did something happen?" "No," Matthew said quickly. "Nothing happened. I just need to focus on what's in front of me right now." There was a pause on the line before Mia spoke again, her voice cooler. "I see. Well, I hope whatever, or whoever, is keeping you so busy is worth it." She ended the call before Matthew could respond. He stared at the phone for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket and turning back to the table. Emily raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Matthew said with a small smile. "Everything's fine." But even as he said the words, he felt a strange sense of relief, like he had just closed a door he didn't need anymore. The end of their trip came faster than either of them expected. As they packed their bags and prepared to leave the villa, an air of bittersweet finality settled between them. Emily zipped up her suitcase, glancing at Matthew as he folded a shirt into his. "So, back to reality, huh?" Matthew looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Something like that. But I'm not sure I'm going back to the same reality I left." Emily tilted her head, curious. What do you mean? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think this trip changed some things for me. Made me realize I'd been chasing the wrong things. Her gaze softened, and she gave him a faint smile. Well, I'm glad it helped. It wasn't just the trip, he added, his voice quieter. It was you. Emily blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. Matthew. You don't have to say anything, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know. They finished packing in silence, the weight of his words lingering in the air. At the airport, as they waited for their flight, Matthew leaned back in his chair, watching the bustling crowd. Emily sat beside him, flipping through a magazine. So, what's next for you? She asked without looking up. Matthew considered the question, his thoughts drifting. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I think it's time to figure that out. Emily glanced at him, her smile faint but encouraging. Well, whatever it is, I think you'll be fine. He turned to her, his expression earnest. What about you? She shrugged lightly. Back to normal life, I guess. Teaching, grading papers, living the dream. Matthew chuckled. You make it sound so glamorous. It has its moments, she said with a wink. As their flight was called, Matthew stood and offered her his hand. Ready? Emily took it, her smile warm. Ready. As they boarded the plane, Matthew felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing anything, or anyone. He wasn't running toward the future or away from the past. He was simply moving forward, and for now, that was enough. The flight home was uneventful, the quiet hum of the plane offering both Matthew and Emily time to reflect. Matthew found himself stealing glances at her as she dozed lightly beside him, her face serene. When they landed, the atmosphere between them shifted slightly. They were leaving the insulated world of the Maldives behind and returning to their separate lives, a reality that neither had fully addressed. As they waited for their luggage, Emily broke the silence. So, what happens now? Matthew hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I guess we go back to our routines, he said carefully. She nodded, though her expression was unreadable. It's been an interesting trip. Yeah, Matthew agreed. It has. For a moment, it felt like that was all they would say to each other. But as they stepped outside to the arrivals area, Matthew turned to her. Emily, wait. She stopped, her suitcase in hand, and looked at him expectantly. I don't know what this means yet, he said, his tone sincere. But I know I don't want to just go back to how things were before. Not completely. Emily's gaze softened. I don't think either of us can, she said gently. They exchanged a quiet smile before parting ways, each feeling the weight of unfinished possibilities lingering in the air. Over the next few weeks, life settled back into its usual rhythm, or at least, it tried to. Matthew returned to his office, his days filled with meetings and calls. But something was different. He felt less driven by the endless chase for success and more focused on finding balance. He hadn't heard from Mia since the trip, and for once, he didn't feel the need to reach out. Whatever pull she had over him was gone, replaced by something he couldn't quite name but knew was tied to Emily. Emily, meanwhile, threw herself back into her teaching, finding comfort in the familiarity of her students and routines. But she, too, felt a shift. She thought of Matthew often, wondering if their time together had been as significant to him as it had been to her. One evening, as Emily graded papers in her small apartment, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and felt her heart skip. It was a message from Matthew. Matthew, hey, I was thinking about that book you mentioned on the plane. Want to grab coffee and tell me more about it? Emily smiled, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing her response. Emily, sure. When? When they met a few days later at a quiet cafe, the conversation flowed as easily as it had on the beach. They talked about books, work, and everything in between, but neither addressed the question hanging between them. It wasn't until they walked out into the crisp evening air that Matthew turned to her. I've been meaning to say this, he began. That trip, it wasn't just a vacation. It made me realize I've been running in circles for a long time, chasing things that don't really matter. Emily watched him, her expression calm but attentive. And meeting you, it reminded me what it feels like to just be present, he said. To enjoy something without worrying about where it's going. Emily's lips curved into a soft smile. I think I needed that reminder, too, she admitted. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city bustling around them. Then Matthew asked, almost hesitantly, do you think we could keep this going? See where it leads? Emily tilted her head, studying him. I think we could try, she said simply. Matthew smiled, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't felt in years. As they walked down the street together, side by side, neither of them knew exactly what the future held. But for the first time, that uncertainty felt like something worth exploring. Matthew's newfound clarity didn't go unnoticed by Mia. She had spent the past few weeks growing increasingly frustrated with his lack of response, her texts and photos met with silence. To someone like Mia, used to being the center of attention, this was unacceptable. So she decided to take matters into her own hands. One evening, as Matthew was unwinding in his apartment, there was a sharp knock at his door. He frowned, setting down his drink, and opened it to find Mia standing there, dressed to impress. Mia, he said, surprised but not entirely pleased. What are you doing here? She smiled, her red lips curving in a way that once would have made him drop everything. I thought I'd stop by. You've been hard to reach lately. Mia, I've been busy, Matthew said, his tone firm but polite. So busy you couldn't respond to my messages? She asked, stepping inside uninvited. Her eyes swept over his apartment, sharp and assessing. We used to have so much fun. What changed? Matthew sighed, closing the door behind her. Mia, this isn't a good time. She ignored him, stepping closer. We had something good, Matthew. Something exciting. You don't just forget that. Matthew looked at her, his expression resolute. It wasn't as good as you think it was. Mia's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. Don't tell me this is about that woman, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. The one you took on that little trip. Matthew didn't respond, but his silence was enough. Mia laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You think someone like her is going to make you happy? Matthew, she's not even in the same league as us. That's enough, Mia, Matthew said firmly. Whatever we had, it's over. I've moved on. She stared at him, her eyes narrowing. You'll regret this, she said coldly before storming out. But Mia wasn't done. The next day, Emily was grading papers in her classroom when the door opened. She looked up, expecting a student, but her smile faded when she saw Mia standing there. Can I help you? Emily asked, her voice cautious. You're Emily, right? Mia said, her tone overly sweet. I'm Mia. I thought it was time we met. Emily frowned, setting down her pen. Okay, what's this about? Mia smirked, pulling out her phone. I thought you should know what kind of man Matthew really is. Emily's stomach sank as Mia began scrolling through her photos. These are all from the past few weeks, Mia said, holding the screen up for Emily to see. He wasn't so distant then, was he? The images were exactly what Emily feared, provocative photos Mia had sent to Matthew during their trip. Emily's face tightened, but she refused to let Mia see her falter. Why are you showing me this? Because I thought you deserved to know who you're dealing with, Mia said, her voice dripping with faux concern. Matthew might act like he's changed, but trust me, he hasn't. Emily stood, her chair scraping against the floor. You don't know anything about him, she said, her voice steady, despite the knot in her chest. Mia raised an eyebrow. Oh, I know plenty. And if you're smart, you'll walk away now. With that, she turned and strode out, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. That evening, Matthew called Emily, his voice warm. Hey, how was your day? Emily hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. It was fine, she said curtly. He frowned, sensing something was wrong. Emily, what's going on? She exhaled sharply. Mia came to see me today. She showed me the photos she sent you. She said some things. Matthew's stomach dropped. Emily, whatever she told you. She said you haven't changed, Emily interrupted, her voice trembling. That you'll always go back to someone like her. Matthew was silent for a moment, guilt and anger warring within him. She's wrong, he said finally. I've made mistakes, Emily. I won't deny that. But you've shown me what I really want. Emily's silence on the other end felt endless. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter. I don't know if I can do this, Matthew. Not if she's always going to be in the picture. She won't be, Matthew said firmly. Mia is my past. You're my future. The conviction in his voice gave Emily pause. I need time, she said finally. I need to think. Take all the time you need, Matthew said, his voice soft. But please don't let her ruin what we've started. As they ended the call, Matthew stared out at the city lights, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took, he wouldn't let Mia come between them. Days turned into a week, and Emily's thoughts swirled endlessly. She couldn't escape the memories of Mia's visit, the cruel words, and the photos that had been meant to sow doubt. And doubt had bloomed, she wouldn't lie to herself about that. But so had something else. Every time she thought of walking away from Matthew, the ache in her chest felt unbearable. She'd replay their conversations, their shared moments in the Maldives, and the way he'd looked at her when he apologized, vulnerable, honest, and so different from the polished man she'd first met. She stood in her small apartment, staring at her packed suitcase. It felt surreal to even consider what she was about to do. Emily had always been cautious, weighing her choices carefully, avoiding risks. But life was messy, and Matthew had taught her that some moments were worth taking a chance on, even if there were no guarantees. Her phone buzzed. A message from him. Matthew, I know I've said it 100 times, but I mean it, take all the time you need. I just hope you know I'm here, waiting for you. Emily exhaled slowly, her resolve solidifying. She texted back, her heart pounding. Emily, I'm on my way. When Emily arrived at his apartment, she hesitated outside the door for a moment before knocking. Matthew opened it almost immediately, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw her standing there. I thought you needed more time, he said softly. I do, Emily admitted. But I don't want to spend that time away from you. Matthew stepped back, letting her inside. She set her suitcase down, the weight of it feeling like the weight of her decision. Are you sure? He asked, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. No, she said, her tone honest but warm. I'm terrified. But I'm tired of letting fear keep me from the things I want. Matthew smiled, a rare softness lighting up his features. You have no idea how much this means to me. Emily gave a faint smile. We'll see if you still say that when I start reorganizing your kitchen. He laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded, and for the first time in days, Emily felt a small sliver of peace. The first few days of living together were a learning curve. Matthew's world of order and structure clashed with Emily's more laid-back approach, but it was a clash that felt oddly comforting. One evening, as they cooked dinner together, Matthew meticulously following a recipe while Emily improvised with spices, he looked at her and smiled. What? She asked, glancing at him over her shoulder. Nothing, he said, shaking his head. Just. I like this. This? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Us, he clarified. Being here with you. It feels right. Emily's heart swelled, but she masked it with a playful smirk. Even when I ruin your perfect recipe? Especially then, he teased. They sat down to eat, the meal slightly over-seasoned but full of warmth. underscore 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 underscore. Mia wasn't completely out of their lives, she made sure of that. A few passive-aggressive messages here, a sly comment there. But Matthew ignored them, his focus entirely on Emily. At first, Emily struggled to shake the lingering shadow of Mia's presence, but over time, Matthew's actions spoke louder than any of Mia's attempts to disrupt their lives. He was present, attentive, and more open than she'd ever seen him. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the city lights, Emily turned to him. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Miss what?" "The way things were before," she said, gesturing vaguely. "The excitement, the games." Matthew was quiet for a moment before shaking his head. "No," he said firmly. "It was never real. This is." Emily leaned back in her chair, letting his words settle over her. Life was unpredictable, full of risks and uncertainties. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid to embrace them. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for sure: she and Matthew were building something worth fighting for.